Hi, I'm Susanna Challen, and I am going to teach you how to art journal. Um, to start with, I want to just let you know a little bit about the structure of this. There's going to be 3 videos, and I'm going to, in this video, cover why to art journal, what it's about, and we'll start with tearing out images from magazines and catalogs. And that is step 1. Then the second video will be step 2. That's going to be making a collage and then gluing down the images for a base layer. And then the third video, step 3, will be taking that collage and bringing paint and other mixed media to transform it into a piece of personal expression. So that is the structure of this. And in this first video, I just want to start by sharing a little bit about what art journaling is. And one of the things about art journaling that I'll come back to again and again is that there are no rules in art journaling. And I love that about it. This is really a time for you to just get in touch with your inner being. And I'm going to show you how I art journal, but I am absolutely sure that you will find your own way. And so this is just a launching point for you. You can see how I do it, and then if something doesn't feel like you, if something comes to mind that you'd rather try, well, go with that instinct and do it your way. I like to, as we start out, just say it can get messy. This is a table where a friend and I were art journaling together. I recommend you find a place where you won't mind making a mess. Today we're just going to be tearing out images, so you just have some paper scraps. But in the second video with the glue, it can be sticky, and with the third video there'll be paint. So just keep that in mind. But overall, I encourage you to find a place where you can be contemplative, free of distraction, whether that's a room to yourself or a corner to yourself, your favorite chair, your favorite blanket, maybe a lap desk or a table where you can light a candle or light some incense, have your cup of tea or your glass of wine. This is really just kind of a time for you. So whatever makes you feel relaxed, cozy, and able to kind of separate out from your normal day-to-day hustle and bustle. And you're going to want today to get some magazines, catalogs, brochures, that type of thing. They should be ones you're done with, ready to throw them away or recycle them. This is a great way to repurpose things that otherwise would end up in the trash. And you can also use any kind of paper. If you have old postcards, I have a photo here of a box of old cards that I had in my closet. Anything is fair game for collage. But before we get to tearing, I will just talk a little bit about the benefits of art journaling, just from my experience, just to give you a sense of why I do this, why I enjoy it so much. And I just like to start by pointing out that the materials are cheap. And it's very accessible. You don't have to be a professionally trained artist to do this. I did take a year and a half of fine art photography classes, but I am not a professionally trained artist otherwise, and this is something that I just kind of taught myself and allowed myself to explore. And one of the things that allows me to really take risks and try things is that the materials are inexpensive. This is stuff that you would otherwise throw away. Acrylic paint is very inexpensive, the glue, and really knowing that if I want to just try painting across the page something that I'm not sure if I can really pull it off, well, you know, what's the worst that can happen when you've only spent a minimal amount on supplies? And really, I find that taking risks is so important with art, and that's what gets me into a piece. And so just that lower cost of entry can make it more fun. I also think it is really a contrast to the day-to-day to-do list. It's a way to be creative, and I think it's so important for our well-being to be creative. This is something that really lifts my spirits. And I think it's a fair question, you know, why would you art journal instead of just journal? And I love journaling as well, the written word, and I think that the best way I can describe when would I art journal instead of just journal is it's when I wouldn't really know what to write. Maybe I'm processing something, maybe I'm not sure how I feel about it. And, those things like I feel a little off, I feel a little down. Um, I, I'm anxious, but I don't know why. Those times can be a great time to work with images. Maybe I don't really know what's going on, but by working with the images, I can get a sense of where I am or what's appealing to me in the moment. I can share with you that I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2018. I started art journaling in 2017, so I was already art journaling, and I found it to be a wonderful practice when I was dealing with things like waiting for test results and scans. Um, there's something called scanxiety that people talk about when you're waiting on that type of thing. And I found that it was a way of, yes, being in the moment, using color and having an opportunity to center, but also to even process, some of the fears and some of the things that I was thinking about at the time. But it doesn't have to be in a stressful moment. It's also a nice way to connect. I've taught this class over Zoom right at the start of the pandemic when people were really social distancing. For those of us who are immunosuppressed, in the winter when you're spending more time indoors, it can be a great way to work with color. And I've met and done an art journaling meetup on Zoom with people who've taken my class over the past 2 years, and it's been a wonderful way to connect with other people as well. So I want to emphasize that it can also just be a lighthearted way to unwind. You can just have color, you can just have fun with textures, composition, images that just you like, that spark joy, as Kondo would say. So in my experience, one of the things that has happened, it doesn't always happen, but sometimes when I do an art journaling piece, I will actually have the experience that the piece will speak back to me. So I will make a piece and I will be the one that created it. But sometimes once I finish and I look down at the piece, I will see a theme or symbols, and it will kind of communicate something to me from my unconscious about what I'm going through. So, in this case, there was a really clear image of a threshold. I've done a piece where I was at a crossroads, and at times it can be interesting just to get that sense of orienting, or this is where I am, and it helps with making meaning, and it helps in those murky times. And like I said, it doesn't happen every time I do an art journaling piece, but sometimes it actually does. And so I like to call it visual free association. So here's a quote about free association, which it means suspending the usual editing and censoring. And I really encourage you to do that when you art journal, to suspend the usual editing and censoring and let it lead you to a place that you would not have anticipated. There can be a wonderful way in which, by just allowing ourselves to be creative and to work with images, we can actually discover some of the undercurrents and themes that might be less front of mind, but still really important to our well-being and where we are in our lives at that time. Overall, I just love to say that art journaling is a way of companioning yourself. And if that sounds strange, this phrase companioning yourself, it's because I made it up. I like using that phrase. You could say befriending yourself, showing up for yourself, taking time to listen to yourself. However you want to say it, it really is a time just to check in and be present for what you're going through in your life. And I like to also say that the reason I keep doing it is because after I art journal, I always feel better. And it really is something that, again and again, has meant so much to me. I hope that if you give it a try with these videos or in any other time in your life, that you will also find benefits. So now I'm going to shift into the actual doing of art journaling. I've just kind of finished my description of why I love it. And so here's how I start. I start with tearing up magazines. And so that's literally tearing up magazines and catalogs, other materials. So that's what we're going to do for the rest of this video. I've got a few more slides. I'm going to show you how I tear. And then I also have a top-down camera at the end where I can actually just kind of do a little tearing and show you how I do it. All right. So what I encourage you to do is to be like a kid, to find treasure in a pile of old magazines. These are, yes, magazines, but now they are just there for you to go through, flip through page by page and just see what catches your eye. And this is the fun part. I want you to just flip through the pages and tear out pictures that catch your eye. Anything that catches your interest, tear it out. If it doesn't, keep going. Now, what kind of magazine? Yes, I have used tourism marketing magazines from a highway oasis. I have repurposed brochures from art museums. Those can be fun because they have great quality paper. I can tell you that the thin pages, like in a People magazine, for example, those are going to wrinkle more easily when you glue them down. The thicker pages, less so. But who cares? This is an art journal and it's just for you. So I actually love having the texture from the different materials. And so this is just to say, you know, get a variety and work with what you have. You don't even have to use a journal. You can use watercolor paper, poster board. I have images of that. You might want to think a little bit about the size of your canvas, so to speak. I usually use a spread in my art journal just to give me enough space. The poster board can be large. It can feel a little bit daunting to work with something that big to start with. But if it's too small, then you can't fit a lot of images. And so thinking about what size you want, I think that something that's, you know, about 18 by 12 maybe could be a good start. I keep junk magazines that come in the mail, you know, things with advertisements actually can have really neat images. And so even the things that come right before the holidays with all these Sharper Image or LL Bean catalogs or whatever you get, those might be great material for art journaling. And I do use old photographs. I will say if they're glossy, I often put those on the top layer, so they're in the bottom corner. On the left is a photograph that I then added some gold paint to. I also took a class with a friend who would print out photos on sort of a manila paper, and then she would work photos of her boys into collages regularly, and that worked really well also. So photographs can be accents or they can actually be part of the collage. And I will say that I have torn up old coffee table books. And I've had people take my class who, one woman said, I was a librarian, I cannot tear a book, and I understand that. So if it's not your thing, you don't have to. But there are some books that are no longer scientifically accurate. They're at an estate sale for $1. They may otherwise end up in the trash bin. I think that it's a great way to repurpose things like that. So I have used from time to time an old coffee table book that would otherwise have been tossed. And then there's a wonderful word, ephemera, and I love this word. In the photograph here, you can see all these little receipts and postcards. There's an old matchbook, coaster. You know, so the definition of ephemera is paper items that were originally meant to be discarded after use but have since become collectibles. And so in this image I have these little collectibles from my life when I was in college. These are little cafes I would go to in New York City when I lived there. It was a little Twinings jasmine green tea bag that I would get at the deli when I got my tea in the morning. You know, these are the types of things that they don't necessarily mean a lot to somebody else, but they mean something to me. And you'll have those things in your life where they carry some type of symbolic meaning or nostalgia, a memory. And you can incorporate that into your art journal because the meaning that the objects hold is for you, and this is just for you. So if you're wondering how to get started, you're just gonna grab some materials and start tearing out images. And I really hope that you lose track of time while you're doing it. And so if you're watching the video, you're welcome to just be tearing out images as I talk. I'm just going to share with you a little bit about how I tear images. I know it sounds like I'm really zooming in here, but I just like to share with you how I do it. And you can, of course, completely ignore what I do and do it your way. So the first thing that I encourage is that you actually tear the magazines and not use scissors. And every time I teach this class, I get resistance on this point. So yes, I said no scissors, and you will likely doubt me on this. It's sort of why not? And it's true that there are no rules in art journaling. So if you want to use scissors, you can use scissors. But just remember that we're not scrapbooking here. This is not about perfectionism. So this isn't about perfect right angles and clean edges. Instead, what I find is that by tearing, I can really get into a flow. And I have this reference to Finding Flow. It's a wonderful book on the subject, but this is when you lose track of time and you're just really engaged in something. So just flipping and tearing and never stopping to pick up the scissors, but just using my hands. It allows me to really get into a flow state. And you can just kind of tap into the right brain looking at all these images. And the tearing can produce these really interesting jagged edges. And those can end up being really neat and interesting parts of the final piece. And so I really think that the jagged edges can be part of the fun. And I encourage you to not worry as you're tearing. Sometimes I'll just tear right through the middle of the piece I was trying to tear out. Well, it's no big deal. It's just a catalog. And sometimes you don't realize it, but the tears are just imperfectly perfect. They end up working out just the way I need them to. So I encourage you to just go through a catalog or magazine, a pile of them if you have it, and just tear out images. You're going to make a pile of images. And I really don't put much more thought into it than that. So don't ask why. If you like it, just tear it out. And you can like just part of an image. You don't have to maintain the original image. Like for example, in this slide, there's a whole scene with a plane crash. And actually, maybe I just want the guy who's parachuting. So you can just take the part you like. I like to point out that edges can be interesting too. Maybe you find this strange horned guy with the paper clip a little too much, but you want the moon. So just take the moon, whatever it is that catches your eye. And don't underestimate advertisements. They can have great shapes and images. And there's really no set amount. You just want to feel like you have an abundance of images to work with when you're going to sit down to collage. So they're just scraps of paper. I encourage you to overall avoid text. And I say that, but sometimes I use text. So it's not a hard and fast rule because there are no rules in art journaling. But I tend to avoid text unless it speaks to me. And I will say that I've had students take my class who use a lot of text. And so that's just something I offer out. But if you decide to start using text, I really encourage you to not stop to read the magazine. Because what happens is you, even though you had this magazine in the recycle bin and it's 6 months old, maybe you find that one article that you meant to read, and the next thing you know, what you're doing is you're reading the article and you are not tearing. And so I encourage you, if you find something you want to read, tear it out, put it to the side, and then keep going. Gather variety. You want to include, some scraps of thicker paper, thinner paper, colors, textures, anything that jumps out. And I try not to get too attached to any particular image as I go, because I really don't know at this stage what is going to come of it all. I just flip and tear, put it in a pile, and keep going. And I encourage you to just trust that you're going to find the images you need. And that might sound strange, but it always works out. Whenever I art journal, whatever materials I have, I always can find a way to make something meaningful out of it. So Maybe this time you just have the magazines that were around your house, and maybe next time you'll find a neat old Life magazine or art museum brochure. Just work with what you've got. This is one piece, and use the materials you have. Trust that you're going to find what you need. And most of all, resist rushing. This is a time for you. So use the time you have, whatever you can set aside, and just allow yourself to leisurely tear. I really find this to be one of the most relaxing parts of art journaling. So after a long day, even if I'm tired, I can just flip through magazines, tear out images, look for treasure, create a pile, and letting it unfold in that way, not trying to be efficient or thinking about productivity in any way, just doing it at my pace, how I want to do it, resisting rushing. That's when it's the most therapeutic, and I also think it fosters the artistic creative process. So just let the process unfold. I have this piece, Take the Gentle Path. And as you're tearing, at some point, you'll finish. And people sometimes ask me, how do you know when you're done? And so I just sort of know. That's not a very helpful answer, is it? But to be honest, that's what happens. I kind of just know, okay, I'm wrapping up, but I'll try to explain a little more. Maybe sometimes I get a little tired. Sometimes I'm running out of magazines. I've gone through the magazines that I had and gone through them twice, and I don't see anything else that's speaking to me or jumping out. Or maybe it's just time to cook dinner, and it's all the time I have. So, once you get a pile that you feel like is enough images to work with, you're gonna kind of put the pile somewhere for safekeeping. Clean up the scraps that might be all over the floor, and just keep that pile for the next time you have time to art journal. And that's what I will be covering in video 2, is sort of the next step. But this is really the goal for this video, is just to create a pile of images, tear them out, and gather them together for you to use in the next video. And when I teach this class, I encourage people to know that it's not just the structure of the class that I'm dividing it this way. When I actually art journal, I actually do find that this can be a good time to pause. Once I have a pile of images, I can come back to it another day, see it with fresh eyes, and so oftentimes that is what I'll do. I'll just tear out, and then I'll come back to it another time, maybe over the weekend or the next week. So I'm going to switch to my top-down camera and just show you a little bit. But before I do that, this is a little list of things that are going to be helpful for you in the second video. You're going to want to bring your pile of images, and then a surface for your collage. So that could be a journal, that could be watercolor paper, that could be an old book that you're going to convert into a journal. I'll show you how that's done. You're going to want something for adhesion. You're going to want to use something to stick the images onto page. And I use something called, I use a brand called Liquitex, and it's a matte gel. And I will show you what that looks like. I've had other people in my class use Mod Podge. You can certainly use washi tape, glue stick, whatever you have that would be an adhesive. And when I'm art journaling, let's say on a trip, or if I'm getting an infusion, I'm not going to take all my my gel matte medium. Instead, I might use something like little stickies or tape. So you might find yourself, depending on where you are, using different things. For this class, I'll use my matte gel, and that's what I learned to art journal with, and so I always like to teach it that way. So if you are using a matte gel, you're going to want to get a wide paintbrush and a water cup, and paper towel can be helpful. So those are the materials that you might want to get together before you watch the second video. But for now, I'm just going to switch to my top-down camera. And here I actually have my art journal, so you can just kind of see what an art journal is like. This is something that I have been working on since 2020, this particular one. And you can see that I used the full spread, and that was kind of the size that ended up working for me. And I just flip through just to show you what it looks like. This is the most recent one I've done. And then I would turn to the next page and start a new piece. But I'll put that aside. We'll get to that next video. Today we're just going to be tearing. So you're going to want to have some magazines. And with the magazines, it can be anything. It can be catalogs. We've got an Atlantic, we've got a National Geographic. For those of you who know Momentum Magazine, you may have MS or you have a loved one with MS. Any kind of magazine. And then you're just going to kind of flip through. And anything that catches my eye, I'm just going to tear it out. And sometimes I'll leave the straight edge just in case I want to use it. And sometimes I'll tear it all out, but I try not to have any straight edges once I collage. That's just kind of how I do it. All right, so you get the idea here. You're just gonna sit and tear. I like to give a little silence so you can get the feel of it. But I'm just gonna go through, one magazine after another, just flipping through and tearing out images. This is an older National Geographic. Sometimes it's kind of fun to get some of the retro ads and just see things from another era. That can be fun to do. I've had people ask me, where do you get your old magazines? Locally there are some places. Our library has a shop that sells old things, old books and magazines. We have a store called the Idea Store that has lots of reused art supplies. But also there's a Facebook group. I don't know if there are in other areas, these kind of swap. We have one that's you can put things on your porch and people will swap for items. So I have swapped for magazines before. I got some great National Geographic and Life magazines that way. So really there's no one way to get magazines. Yes, I use new magazines too. So you can just kind of see how you encounter paper items. I had someone in my last class ask if I ever used just entirely digital images, using masking in Photoshop, for example. And I don't, but one of my students did, and she did everything working digitally. And I really think that is a personal preference. For me, it's so nice to get off of the screen and to actually use paper, use my hands, and to just go through and find images to work with. But that's sort of what I enjoy doing. And so, I have these images that I've torn out, and I have a bunch that I've done kind of prior tearing. So, you can just kind of see what's a lot to work with. This is probably more than I need, but that'll be plenty. And I encourage you to get a sense of abundance because, this is not a process, like I said, that uses expensive materials, and you just want to have a lot to work with so that you can kind of go with your instincts, go with your flow when it comes to our next step of collage. So then I'll just show you a few of the supplies just so you can get a visual. This is the Liquitex matte gel that I use, and it's something that you can just order on Amazon or your local art supply store. I have one that's already open. So you can see it's kind of this this liquid, and so we're going to use that for pasting down our collage. And I'll have a water cup, some paper towel. Here's my little water cup, and my journal, and that's what I'm going to use for the next class. So that is the first stage of art journaling: tearing out images, getting a pile of images. Check our next video for step 2 whenever you feel like moving toward collage and pasting down your base layer. Thanks for joining.